Welcome back. I know we didn't have much of a break, but we had really good information and we want to keep things moving and flowing. So thank you for sticking with us and understand that if you got to step away, that's great, but our keynote speaker is not one that you'll want to miss. As we continue to dive into education as a cornerstone of the long-term health of Kentuckians, I'm pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Willie Carver, who will speak about fostering systems change that support accessible learning, opportunities, and education experience for all students. Willie works in the Undergraduate Resource Center at the University of Kentucky's Gatton College. A 17-year teaching veteran, Willie has taught at the university and high school levels in Kentucky, Georgia, Vermont, and France. Willie has a dual endorsed master's in teaching in French and English, a rank 1 in French linguistics, and additional graduate work in English and skillful teaching. He has published a great deal of research and presented on many of subjects as a member of the Kentucky World Language Association, the Council of Teachers of English, and the Kentucky Philological Association, Education Camp, Education Rising, the Center for Collaborative Literacy, and the Kentucky Education Summit, just to name a few. Willie was ranked a 2021 Teacher Who Makes a Difference and was the 2022 Kentucky Teacher of the Year. Willie, I'm looking forward to hearing your presentation. I am excited to invite you to our platform and really I'm excited to hear you and understand how we can foster those positive learning experiences for all students. So please welcome Willie Carver to the stage.
Allison, thank you so much for that kind invitation. And I will try my best to speak to answering that question as well as justifying that question. That's sort of my goal. So my name is Willie Edward Taylor Carver Jr. I'm the 2022 Kentucky Teacher of the Year. I would love to thank the 2022 Howard Bost Memorial Policy Forum for giving me this opportunity to speak on issues that are important to our students, specifically to Alexander Curley, who reached out and coordinated so much of this event. And I want to begin, as I promised my students I always would, by saying that I'm gay, Appalachian, and proud of both facts. I believe that education is about truth, authenticity, voice, story, and life. But many of my students tell me that they feel that school prevents them from authenticity and voice. And so I honor their struggle in the darkness by bringing proudly and consistently into the light any parts of myself that they may share, that they may feel less than pride about, that they may feel fear about expressing, so that perhaps this light will reach them. The embodiment of light in the school I taught at is a student club called Open Light. Open Light is a student-led group that focuses on community projects like cleaning parks, education like teaching themselves Black and LGBTQ history, and school edification like raising money for mental health awareness and anti-bullying programs. It's the definition of light in education. A few years ago, when a group of my students spoke about the poor treatment of LGBTQ students in our school, they openly voted to make the club bear the words LGBTQ inclusive in its name, an intentional choice to invite, include, and advocate for their classmates. Light. However, as I speak, Open Light faces a threat from some community members in my hometown of Mount Sterling, Kentucky. A single person, buttressed by a group of her church members, based solely upon the fact that Open Light is inclusive of LGBTQ people, including some who are out, like some ex-students and me, has taken to attacking it online and at school board meetings. She called our club a grooming ground, called it sexually based, claimed that I engaged with students based upon their sexuality, and suggested that I groom ex-students, and went so far as to publicly share their and my contact information and photos online while calling us deviant, unethical, and suggesting that my co-teachers and I were engaging in predatory behavior. Of course, her evidence is simply that I'm gay, and my advocacy, in which I encourage LGBTQ youth to carry on, not give up, and reach out if they need help. All, of course, are moments of light, of caring, and love. Many of my students were afraid and I can understand. I too am concerned about the darkness of this behavior, which is becoming an increasingly normalized approach to attacking LGBTQ teachers, students, parents, and their vocal allies. I repeatedly asked for my superintendent to intervene to speak up for our group, as have many parents of the students, given that this woman's rhetoric has been shared online, in board meetings, and in the local newspaper. His response to me was that even though she is clearly lying, the ability to directly address every social media post disagreeing with something associated with our schools and district is not feasible. I spoke to lawyers. I submitted a letter to the Kentucky Professional Standards Board. I testified to Congress. I got no help. I quit teaching after 2 decades in education as the 2022 Kentucky Teacher of the Year because I could no longer be a part of that system. I worked with the only other LGBTQ person in my department. She too faced such harassment and received so little support that she also quit teaching last year after more than a decade in the classroom. Teachers are drowning trying to support Black, Brown, and LGBTQ students, and they often feel that there is no way they can continue. Teachers in Kentucky and across the US are speaking up about this discrimination. Kurt Russell, not the actor, but the 2022 National Teacher of the Year is one of the kindest, most inspiring men I have ever met. He speaks on a platform of giving voice to all students, and he spoke the words LGBTQ student out loud at the White House in April. He recently told me that his school has received nearly daily messages and many emails using the N-word and making threats against him. Some states have even discussed banning him from coming to speak at all, given his insistence on talking about the needs of Black, Brown, Hispanic, and LGBTQ students. In another example, a teacher in Kentucky received literal threats of violence following him writing on a board, along with the colors of trans inclusivity, "You are free to be yourself with me, you matter," after a trans student had come out of his school. He was suspended amidst these death threats. He received no support, and he resigned. I don't mention these moments to bum us all out. I am a positive and hopeful person at heart. That hope, that dreaming, that image of the world is at the core of who I am as an educator. When I see any person, they become a student to me, I see possibility brimming. And I always ask 2 questions. What do they need to make this possibility happen? And how can I help? This same teaching approach I have learned as the 2022 Kentucky Teacher of the Year can be applied to systems. I can look beyond what is and see hopeful possibility. I can ask what needs to happen to make that possibility a reality, and then ask what I need to do to make it happen. And the need to make things happen has never been greater, especially for young Black, Brown, gay, and trans students. According to the Trevor Project's 2021 National Survey on LGBTQ youth mental health, 42% of LGBTQ youth seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year. And a full 50% of transgender youth seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year. Here are the total number of children considering suicide from all groups to give us something against which to measure the roughly 50% of LGBTQ students. 12% of white youth, 31% of Native and Indigenous youth, 21% of Black youth, 21% of multiracial youth, 18% of Latinx youth, 12% of Asian Pacific Islander youth, and the national average is 18%. As you can imagine, being in multiple categories increases the likelihood of serious suicidal thoughts and planning. But it is possible to lower these thoughts as well. That same report shows us that LGBTQ youth who felt high social support from their family reported attempting suicide at less than half the rate of those who felt low or moderate social support. And LGBTQ youth who report having at least one accepting adult were 40% less likely to report a suicide attempt in the last year. That means a lot. It means that LGBTQ youth who are supported either at home or at school are really no more likely to consider suicide than any other student. But sadly, many of our students do not have a single accepting adult in our lives. And new legislation, like the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, or rumored bills on the docket for Kentucky's next legislative session, are going to make it even harder for those students to find a single supportive adult. New extremist laws are making support for LGBTQ kids illegal, or are so ambiguously worded that teachers and counselors who try to be supportive won't know if they're breaking the law. And oftentimes breaking the law comes with heavy fines. New extremist laws are making the inclusion of Black and Brown students' needs to see themselves reflected in the classroom curriculum illegal, or again, are so ambiguously worded that school districts that want to include them are going to find it harder and more frightening to do so. This is a serious health issue. If there was a food or drink that killed white students at twice the rate of other students, we would not serve it. If there was a medication that killed straight students at 5 times the rate of LGBTQ students, we would outlaw it. But we're not talking about straight, cis, or white students. We're talking about Black, Brown, and LGBTQ students. And they often are not given as much value in our system as their counterparts. Our practices and our ways of being are harmful to these children. According to the Trevor Project, a full 94% of LGBTQ youth reported that recent politics negatively impact their mental health. But let's remember that this survey was done in 2021, before senators and congresspeople began calling LGBTQ teachers and students groomers and predators, before Florida made it illegal for LGBTQ students to talk about themselves in the classroom, before Oklahoma made it a fireable offense for teachers to say anything in class that might offend the views of any parent or student, before Tennessee made it a law that teachers would be allowed to use dead names and dead pronouns with trans students if their religious beliefs weren't in alignment with trans identities. Even if every statistic available shows that dead naming and intentionally harassing students by using the wrong pronoun increases mental health problems and the likelihood of death. Before any of these things happened, 94% of LGBTQ students were already feeling that their mental health was negatively influenced by politics. How much worse must the feelings be, and how much more prevalent now? That same nationwide data tells us that only 33% of LGBTQ youth find their home to be LGBTQ affirming. That means that the vast majority of LGBTQ students live in homes in which they are shunned or harmed for being LGBTQ. And school was, until recently, the only safe haven these students have. It is no longer. As of 2021, 70% of LGBTQ youth stated that their mental health was poor most of the time. In another study, over 70% reported that they were consistently miserable. LGBTQ students are simply in despair. And again, I warn, those numbers were published last year. They necessarily have to be worse now. They also have little help for this misery. In fact, a full 48% of LGBTQ youth reported that they wanted mental health counseling from a mental health professional, but were unable to receive it in the past year. This was before schools began to mandate teachers outing students. This was before schools in Florida began to make a list of LGBTQ students. That number is now lower than 48%. The bulk of LGBTQ students are consistently miserable, and the majority have no access to resources to help them. I don't want to live in these numbers today to make us see all the ugliness, but I want to remind us that even if there are shiny gay and trans people on our television screens, this is only because advocates are fighting like hell to give these children some moment in their lives when they can feel good about themselves and imagine a future. Because outside of television, they can't. And this is a health crisis. Discrimination at school is causing health issues that in any other population would cause sirens to go off. 90% of LGBTQ youth reported that they had experienced discrimination based upon their orientation or gender identity. 72% of LGBTQ youth reported symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder in just the past 2 weeks, including more than 3 in 4 transgender and non-binary youth. 62% of LGBTQ youth reported symptoms of major depressive disorder in the past 2 weeks, including more than 2 in 3 trans students. And worst of all, 13% of LGBTQ youth reported being subjected to conversion therapy, with 83% reporting it occurring when they were under age 18. That last statistic is to me the most frightening because I know the effects of conversion therapy. According to Statica, roughly 11% of randomly selected LGBTQ youth, here defined through the age of 25, had attempted suicide in the last year. Not thought about, attempted. That's 1 in 10. Of those who underwent conversion therapy, that number is 28%. Conversion therapy, in which a young person is forced to undergo practices attempting to change their gender identity or sexual attraction, results not just in 1 in 3 LGBTQ people who've undergone it to attempt suicide. Anyone who had any point in their lives been forced to attend it was 28% likely to have attempted suicide in the last 12 months. So time since the practice was not a factor in determining that number. So we have a large group of young people who are very likely to commit suicide, to attempt to suicide, who are self-described as miserable, and who are losing the safest space they had as we sit here. And this matters because 20% of students' waking hours are spent in school, and 50% of their waking hours during the academic year are spent in school. And yet, according to GLSEN's 2020 data, the majority of LGBTQ students feel that they are not free to be themselves at home. Home isn't safe. School isn't safe. And it's becoming less and less safe. So school is problematic, and yet sadly, it is the most important way for LGBTQ students to find possibility for happy lives. According to the Gay and Lesbian School Network, 8% of trans students considered dropping out of school compared to 1% of the national average. And gay or lesbian students were twice as likely to drop out as their straight counterparts. LGBTQ students were also 3 times more likely to have missed school in the last month because they simply felt unsafe. And there is a lot more data here that I'm not going to share because it's a lot to take in, although it is in the chat. But I want us all to remember that what for us is a moment of data is the lived experience of LGBTQ youth across this country, who represent 40% of Generation Z. If we are going to save these young people, we have to start by saving schools. In a country facing increased food insecurity, an energy crisis, a global pandemic, a difficult time discerning truth, a nearly non-functional political system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, it is clear why schools have suddenly become such intense focal points on which we project our crises. Because fear and uncertainty lurk everywhere, and our children represent our hope. They are our future. They are precious. With such conflicting narratives, many groups are clinging desperately to the idea that if only they can influence the way schools create future citizens, then perhaps they can create a future in which they are less afraid. And let's face it, we have different fears. My biggest fear would be seeing us go backwards even more or to stay stagnant on issues of LGBTQ and BIPOC inclusion and rights. For others, this fear is the support of LGBTQ kids as a supposed political agenda. Their fear is based in a few things, most of which I believe arise from an imagined competition for resources. I think to the often repeated response to Black Lives Matter with all lives matter, or the sudden influx of commenters on social media platforms during Pride Month who ask questions like, what about Straight Pride Month? Or who suggest that if all students matter, then we don't need to talk about, think about, or focus on LGBTQ students. The fallacy of this fear, ironic in contrast with the word all, is that LGBTQ students do not exist in opposition to non-LGBTQ students. Black and brown students do not exist in opposition to white students. Minoritized students exist alongside straight, cis, white students. Focusing attention or resources on them is no more anti-white or anti-straight than taking your daughter to the hospital when she breaks her leg is in opposition to her brother who is in perfect health. Caring about one person or group does not indicate a lack of commitment to all people. In fact, quite the opposite. It actually does indicate a commitment to all people, especially when they're in need. To borrow a Christian analogy, leaving 99 found sheep to find one lost sheep isn't anti-found sheep. It is pro-all sheep. And to return to my approach to teaching, namely, looking with hope and asking what we need, we're left with two conflicting versions of hope, two conflicting ideas of the need necessary to meet it. And to answer this question, I want to turn to some students I've met this year. My first speaking engagement as the active 2022 Kentucky Teacher of the Year was at the Educators Rising Conference in Louisville. A young queer student came up to me afterwards and handed me a Post-it with a beautiful sketch of a pair of colorful eyes and the words, "Thank you for speaking." Later, a dozen other students asked me to please come help them, talking to me about specific anti-LGBTQ issues at their schools. And I did what I could for every group, which wasn't enough. Last summer, I was invited to testify before American Congress about the silencing in teachers and students to the same committee investigating the January the 6th attacks. As I opened my notepad, seated with 6 or so suited up DC lawyers, that sketch fell out. Despite my nerves, there lay a colorful and tender reminder of why I must speak up for these young people. This summer, I interviewed a great deal of Appalachian students about their experiences with life, and I noticed a trend that ties to what we're talking about today. All of them had beautiful futures imagined for themselves, cosmetologist, doctor, teacher, etc. But 95% of them, that's 19 out of 20, when asked why they wanted this future, talked about the fears that they had about what life could look like if they didn't make good choices. They fear drug abuse, they feel poverty, they fear having no options. These students were, by and large, driven from fear rather than hope. I began to ask them directly how we can shift this paradigm, and one precocious sophomore said to me, maybe honor? Can we honor the real things that cause fear by choosing hope? Honor, hope. These are the best ideas of our youngest minds in Kentucky, those onto whom we are all projecting our hopes and fears at the moment. And they feel the fear and stress of this projection. We can talk to them and hear it. So when I consider what we must do, I will listen to her. I will honor and I will hope. First, we must not only listen to our young people, we must create avenues to hear them. The first day I met with my LGBTQ affirming group, Open Light, 6 years ago, in a totally student-directed forum, I was not expecting them to say that they felt the school was hostile to poor students. I grew up quite poor and surrounded by poverty in Eastern Kentucky, and I thought that the school was doing an adequate job until they spoke. They listed example after example of ways in which school created unintentional barriers to their success, from students purchasing novels for English class to students having to pay fines for not having a parking pass that they couldn't afford in the first few weeks of school. We were able to shift our educational practices, and the school was on board, not because of outside professional development, but because we listened firsthand to the students affected after creating an opportunity for them to speak. And as professionals who want to help, you can not only create avenues, but you can prevent them from being shut down. According to the most recent Gallup poll to measure it, 81% of Americans said that gay and lesbian people should be hired to teach in elementary schools. According to the Survey Center on American Life, the majority of Americans are not bothered by LGBTQ characters in books, and the majority of Americans under the age of 64 don't oppose pride flags in the classroom. Why then are we seeing such staunch and dangerous legislation, given the fact that the majority of Americans are not threatened by LGBTQ people? I can only posit two reasons. One, People aren't opposed to LGBTQ people, but they don't care. This idea might have some truth. Perhaps the queer child is simply too queer for their life to matter to most Americans. Perhaps alive or dead, they have equal weight. But I have a hard time believing this because I've met people, even people who aren't comfortable with LGBTQ identities, and people are good. My other positive reason is that people don't know or don't want to know. They simply think that this is a small issue about curriculum, about control of school materials, or think there is too much risk in supporting LGBTQ students. But this issue is perhaps the most important issue of a generation. For the last 5 years I taught, every year I had some form of student suicide attempt. Every year. And every single queer teacher friend I have either resigned or was fired last year. All of us. So my ask for all of you is that you talk about it. You have conversations with people. You make social media posts about the needs of LGBTQ youth. You find organizations like the Kentucky Youth Law Project and make donations. Speak up. I recently spoke to Kentucky's leading advocate for legislation to make conversion therapy illegal. And she told me that there were actually more Republicans committed to her bill than Democrats. This was shocking, so I asked her why she thought this was. She said, because people don't ask for it. They don't talk about it. So leaders won't take the risk. This is on us. I realized after I spoke with her that I have never actually advocated against conversion therapy politically before either. Not a single email to a senator or congressman. I wrote one that night. I will write many more. This is the charge I leave all of you with. I wish I had some magic lens or paradigm to fix these issues, some approach that would save them all. If I did, I would have done it years ago. But our system changes come from knowledge, stories, and speaking up, from generating empathy. This is how we change the world. 3 days ago, I received an email from a trans student in rural Kentucky who listed a dozen incidents and practices at their school that were harmful to LGBTQ students. They wanted help. And I was able to connect them to the Kentucky Youth Law Project, where I am on the board, and we will be providing free legal aid to make changes at that school. One single student, a student facing down everything I have talked about, is going to change their entire school district. So I ask, what might we all change if each of us speaks up? Thank you.
Wow, Willie, thank you so much. Just a sound check, Willie, give me a nod. You can hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Fantastic. I just want to wrap up. I know we're close to lunch, but Willie, it's so good to hear you share stories to go with the numbers. I think it's important that we put the two together, and stories are super important. And I heard some 3 key takeaways from you today. And first is overcoming fear. Supporting systems change that supports your ability and the ability of others to speak up and reach out. And then also so important, caring about one group does not mean that you don't care about the rest of everyone else. And in fact, it solidifies that you care about the entire population when you focus on the group that needs the most help at that time. And I loved your analogy about 2 children heading to the ER. You don't take them both to the ER, you take the one that needs it. And so fantastic analogy there. And what a great message. Listen to the young people, number one, but you can't stop there. You have to create the path that let them know that they're being heard. And fantastic stories that you tell us. The students coming to you, wanting to be heard. Just recently, I participated in a student engagement workshop and identifying some of those policies in place that do create barriers that just are, perhaps unintended. And so if we heard from the students how those policies actually make them feel, I think the change of heart can move mountains inside our systems. And so, take risk. That's the last message I heard. Take risk for change and, step up, speak out, and be the change agents that our LGBTQ youth need, our Black and Brown populations need, and our children who are living in poverty, no matter what color, no matter what gender they are, it doesn't matter. Speak up and step up for the people who need us most. So Willie, thank you so much. I know that we'll have a lot of takeaways across the state of Kentucky from your presentation today, building community and support networks for those Kentuckians who need us most.
Thank you so much. It was absolutely an honor. And I just want to emphasize that beyond everything else, just having those conversations is what's most important, because there are so many narratives that are based upon faulty information. When I think about the criticism that I mostly get, it you shouldn't be teaching those kids X, Y, or Z. And I think I've never taught them anything in this particular case. I just say to them, it's okay if you exist. And so people who think that they're preventing, say, teachers from teaching LGBTQ issues in the classroom, what they're actually doing is creating environments in which kids can't exist. And given what we know, we can't have that. So the more we talk about this, the more we generate language so that people can understand what's happening. Because people are good. I know we're going to win this. The question is, how many children do we lose until it's won?
Absolutely. Willie, thank you very much.